Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fourth episode of the Theosbound podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about typology and patterns in history. So I will pass it off to my wonderful co-host, Nate, to introduce the concept of typology.
All right, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm very excited to talk about this. This is a very interesting topic, and we're gonna learn some cool little facts here. So before we start talking about history and typology, first we need to understand that history in its truest sense is always Christian history. The world in its truest sense is a Christian world. Every fact about the world is necessarily a Christian fact because the world doesn't exist outside of this Christian lens. If we accept the reality of the Christian God, who is a personal God concerned with his creation, then when we look back at history, what we should see is not just a biography of God's creation, but a biography of God himself working in creation. St. Maximus talks about the three incarnations of the Logos. He talks about how there's the incarnation of God in creation, there's the incarnation of God in Scripture, and there's the incarnation of God in the flesh, Jesus Christ, of course. The reason that I bring that up is because the scriptural incarnation, the Bible, is the framework through which we are meant to understand the incarnation of God in creation. The symbols presented to us in the Bible are meant to show us how it is that the world works. And I mean, you can see this so clearly in Job and Proverbs when we hear all these analogies with animals and with different phenomena in creation. We're supposed to take that and understand that the way that creation works points us towards God. And the symbols presented to us in Scripture show us how exactly it is that all these different aspects of creation work together and point up towards God. And it's in the mutual interpretation of the scriptural incarnation and the incarnation of God in creation that we see how all things point towards the incarnation of Christ in the flesh. So we will look back in history and we see how it is that creation has functioned in history, and we see where history has brought us today. We're meant to understand and we're meant to look at it in the context of it all pointing towards Christ, using or within the framework of the symbol set up in Scripture. One of the most significant patterns that we see in Scripture and in global history as a whole is the threefold progression that can be described as priest, king, and prophet. This is an extremely important biblical pattern. We will link a article from Cabane, or Seraphim Hamilton, as he's now going by, in the description, where he talks a bit about this priest, king, prophet progression. And I think I might do a video separately at some point on my own channel talking about this. But for now, just to kind of give you a brief understanding of this progression and why exactly it applies to what we're about to talk, so that you have a general idea of what we're about to talk about and why this is a pattern that works. Priests are those who listen to God and they obey God. Kings are those who take what they have learned from listening and then they go out and they act in wisdom. And then the prophets are those who represent the perfecting union of all things. So this triad also corresponds with the progression from Father, Son, and Spirit, as well as the Dionysian triad of purification, illumination, and perfection. And this triad permeates so much of Scripture, but we can't get into all of that now. So for now, we're just going to keep it limited to the three patriarchs, Abraham representing the priest who listens to God and obeys God, Jacob, or Israel, being the king who takes what he's learned and goes out and acts in the world in wisdom, and then Joseph as the prophet who unites all things. All right?
All right. So, yeah, in this video, we are going to be showing a concrete example of typology in history. And I guess the goal is to show that, well, for one, that this isn't arbitrary and this isn't coincidental. This is a pattern, and there are a lot of undeniable quote unquote coincidences here that I just don't think can be dismissed as coincidences. And yeah, so
Yeah.
to
Just before we get into it, I do want to just comment on how even just your we also have to understand this triad again within the Trinitarian context of Father, Son, and Spirit. And I think probably one of the most obvious instances of this Trinitarian unfolding of history is actually in the reversal of this movement in the death of God, which you did a video on, which that's a genius. That's a very genius observation that really solidifies this idea of how history moves in this Trinitarian context. And when you're moving in opposition to God, it moves necessarily in this anti-Trinitarian progression.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks for pointing that out. So this video is going to show how the three Old Testament patriarchs, Abraham, Jacob, and Joseph, typologically correspond with the three ancient Greek philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Our main thesis here is that just as the three patriarchs prefigured and paved the way for the Mosaic covenant, the three philosophers paved the way for the new covenant of Jesus Christ. And the point really is to show that history is typological. It follows certain patterns because God is active in history, and he orders the events in history in a specific way that corresponds to his own Trinitarian life. So to begin, Abraham, who is the father of Israel, corresponds with Socrates, who is the father of philosophy. The first connection is that Abraham is the only one of the three patriarchs not born into wealth, and the same goes for Socrates. He is the only one out of the three philosophers who was not born into wealth.
Yeah, and just as Abraham left his home to create a new nation and evangelize, Socrates also left his home to teach and discuss philosophy.
And Abraham was wandering around and accumulating followers in the same way Socrates very famously wandered around teaching philosophy and accumulating his own followers.
Yeah, and on that note, it's definitely worth mentioning how, because you could say something similar about how all the other philosophers and patriarchs also, oh yeah, they also wandered around, and yeah, sure, they had followers too. But Abraham and Socrates are unique in the sense that they accumulated this sort of inner circle of followers, and then it's not until the next generation that we see this extend beyond an inner circle, so to speak, and out into the world.
Exactly.
That also goes to correspond with the priest, king, prophet pattern that we talked about earlier. But
right.
Abraham, sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say that also it's just more obvious of a point is that Socrates and Abraham were both the first to begin what they were doing.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah.
And Abraham, just like Socrates, they went out and they defended monotheism against a pagan society. And
they did. Oh yeah, they both did. Sorry.
Yeah.
I thought you were
And
being gender neutral.
No. on this note, it's interesting to mention how in Jewish tradition about Abraham, he actually worked in his father's idol shop, and then one day, just out of the blue, he decided to follow the one true God, the monotheistic God of Old Testament Judaism and New Testament Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And when he decided to follow God, he went out and he destroyed all of his dad's idols, and then his dad took him before Nimrod, and Nimrod cast him into a fire because he denied. He actually, what's interesting is Abraham was tested by Nimrod. Nimrod asked him to worship fire and water, and then when he refused to worship the elements, he was cast into the fire, and God then pulled him out of the fire and saved him in order that he could go out and continue preaching God. And I think that has a very, that's not scriptural necessarily, but that does have a foundation in Jewish tradition. And I think that it's interesting to mention in the context of Socrates being one who was killed for his defending of monotheism against the pagan world which he lived in. And
he was he was killed. Like the charges against him was blaspheming the gods of Athens or something like that.
yeah,
So,
in a way, you could say that he refused to worship the elements the same way
mhm.
Abraham did.
Yeah,
And
and just as Abraham destroyed his idols, or his father's idols, Socrates destroyed the idols philosophically, destroyed the idols of Athens through argumentation, because
yeah,
Plato was, I mean, famously defended monotheism on a philosophical level, and so did
yeah,
Aristotle and
yeah.
Socrates.
And you could say that the correspondence of Abraham being cast into the fire and saved by God is paralleled in Socrates' life by him being killed, and he descended into Hades, and then Christ came down and pulled him out of Hades. And that is actually iconographically depicted in certain churches, Christ meeting the Greek philosophers in Hades, but that's not, we can get to that later if we want to.
Saint Justin Martyr said Socrates is in heaven, so there's
that. So to keep it short, there's definitely precedence in tradition for that belief, or holding the idea that Socrates is saved.
Yep. Okay, and Abraham engaged in Socratic dialogue with God. Maybe you want to go over that, Nate?
Yeah. So this is a point that Seraphim Hamilton drives home a lot, and he's the reason that I very cabased. He's the reason that I know about this. Well, he's the reason that I know about a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about here. But anyways, people often will take a look at Abraham talking with God, interceding on behalf of Sodom and Gomorrah, and they'll criticize Christianity and Judaism, and they'll say, "Oh, look, your God needs to be consulted. Why would an omnipotent God need to be consulted?" But the thing is, God didn't need to be consulted. God is just so loving, and within the Trinitarian understanding of God, he necessarily extends himself outside of himself to the other, and so he wants to bring his creation up into his own life and his own love. So he extends himself down towards Abraham and brings Abraham up into the life of the Trinity by engaging in this quote unquote Socratic dialogue.
Yep. And and it's in this way that Abraham learns that God will never destroy the righteous along with the unrighteous. And yeah, so obviously Socrates invented Socratic dialogue. Well, he didn't really invent it, because I mean it's in the Old Testament, but but yeah, and also I mean Jesus also very obviously used Socratic methods of dialogue as well. So there's that.
Yep.
Okay, so moving on to the next slide, we have Jacob, also known as Israel. He is a parallel of Aristocles, also known as Plato. So Jacob was born into wealth, just as Plato was born into wealth. Plato actually, I believe, came from a royal bloodline.
Yeah, and him coming from a royal bloodline is obviously not just random when we understand, as we talked about earlier, the progression of priest, king, and then prophet, Jacob and Plato, or Israel and Plato, being in the place of the king. And them being in the place of the king, we would expect, just as Israel is presented in scripture, or Jacob is presented in scripture, he acts as a king and he rules over his household and his flocks, which Abraham originally accumulated. And Plato, interestingly, came up with the idea of the philosopher king.
Yep. And now the next one. This one is probably the biggest quote unquote coincidence out of all of these. Although there is a big one on the next slide, but Jacob very famously wrestled with God, and Plato is the only one out of these three philosophers who was a wrestler. And that leads to the next one, which is
that Jacob's name was obviously changed by God later in life, and it's important to note here that the person who Jacob wrestled with was God, and it's the person who he wrestled with that changed his name, the same way that Plato's wrestling coach was the one who gave him a new name. That's just mind blowing right there.
That
Like
is
you
not
can't you
a
can't make that up.
coincidence.
You
No.
can't make that up.
Um, yeah, so that's a big one. Just want to emphasize again how big that is. Like, really, if you're listening to this, just stop and think about how big of a coincidence that is. And then we'll move on to the next one, which is that Jacob was a slave to Laban because he was, I believe, forced to work for him for was it 7 years longer than he was supposed to?
Well, he was forced to work for 7 years for a daughter who he didn't want to originally marry,
Mm,
and then another 7 years, and
yeah.
yeah, it just wasn't a very good situation.
No, it wasn't ideal. And then Plato was also sold into slavery by a pupil of his. So Laban was like I think Jacob thought he could trust him, but he couldn't. And I
Yeah,
believe Plato probably thought he could trust his own pupil, but he sold him into slavery. You don't hear about that happening too much anymore. Um,
thankfully. I think
yes,
that goes to show just how much the world really has changed since then.
facts. Okay, next slide is Joseph, who is a parallel of Aristotle. Uh, and so the first one is that Joseph was sold into slavery at age 17. So his whole story of his life really begins at age 17. And same with Aristotle, who joined Plato's Academy at age 17. Now, this is the big one. This is probably it's up there with the Plato wrestler one. Joseph was a mentor to Pharaoh, the most powerful king in the world at the time. And similarly, Aristotle was a mentor to Alexander the Great, the most powerful king in the world at his time. You have anything to say about that?
Yeah, and I I'm not exactly sure if this is a connection that works with Aristotle, but I have a very vague memory of us talking about it before. The pharaoh that followed the pharaoh which Joseph mentored was not a nice pharaoh, to say the least, towards Israel.
Not a nice pharaoh. Yeah, and was Alexander's son or whatever not? I'm pretty sure they weren't.
I
Whoever took
I
over, I'm
have
pretty sure
a
wasn't good. I
yeah,
know
I
that
have a
his
very vague memory of us talking about that and
yeah
discovering that he wasn't. But
yeah his empire was basically destroyed in like one generation, though. I know that.
yeah,
I'm
and
pretty sure.
that's very similar to well, I wouldn't say very similar, but that there's definitely
Yeah,
precedent for
there's
you to connect
similarities.
that to the destruction or the fall of Egypt after their uh, failure to follow in the Pharaoh who Joseph mentored footsteps.
Yes. Yes. Okay, and the next one, this one is well, these next two ones are more uh they're skeptical. I don't know. Yeah, they're these ones I don't know what I believe them. So they're basically Joseph probably brought philosophy to Egypt and therefore to Greece because Egypt, the Greeks basically got philosophy from Egypt. And just to back that up a little, Seraphim Hamilton, already mentioned, he has a video, a pretty old video. It's actually 6 years old now, where he talks about how he talks about the historical and biblical precedents for believing that Joseph was um, uh, well, for one, he's described as the most wise man by Pharaoh himself, the most wise man existing in Egypt at the time. Um, and also, if you go by the revised biblical chronology or the chronology that is accurate with the Bible and not what random academics say it is, I believe the um, the chancellor to the pharaoh, uh, known as Imhotep, he would have lived at the same time as Joseph, and Imhotep was known as to be an extremely wise man at the time, and to have profoundly impacted Egyptian society. And later on, he was actually deified as a god of healing. And I mean, to make the connection to, I mean, and if we're assuming you don't have to, like the listener doesn't have to, but if you want to be charitable and just go with us in assuming that Imhotep was the biblical figure Joseph, then just as Imhotep profoundly impacted Egypt, uh, Aristotle also profoundly influenced Eastern Christianity, Western Christianity, and Islam. And he was known as he's one of the most famous polymaths in history. And Imhotep was actually deified as the god of healing, and Aristotle is known as the father of evidence-based medicine. I took that quote from the internet, so not just making it up. Uh, and yeah, sorry, I talked for a long time there. Do you have anything to add to that?
Well, just one, well, a couple things. First of all, the Imhotep being deified as a god of healing is not irrelevant if we are assuming that he is Joseph, because the biblical portrait of Joseph is one that's entirely inseparable from the idea of healing, particularly healing of a dysfunctional family, which Seraphim Hamilton has. We've mentioned him quite a few times now, but he does have a very good video among his many other very good videos on how God heals the world through a dysfunctional family. And he does talk about Joseph as one who through whom this healing is accomplished. And that also is very relevant to the position of Joseph within the priest, king, prophet progression as the prophet who unites all things. Remember that prophethood is associated with unity and perfection and bringing things together. And so is healing. Healing, the entire idea of health is the reunification of things that were broken apart from each other. And one last thing, just a little note for the idea of philosophy being brought from Israel to Egypt, then to Greece. The first Greek philosopher, or I think Aristotle lists him as the first Greek philosopher. You can correct me if I'm wrong about that, but what was his name? Thales again, right?
Yeah, Thales or whatever.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's pretty interesting. He founded the which school? The Milesian school.
Milesian. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Um, and you said that he studied in Egypt, did he not?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes. And
that's
so
right.
did
And
Plato. So did Plato, by the way.
okay, okay. And it's interesting just how similar some of the views that you see pop up in early Greek philosophy, how similar they are to things that you would hear in Jewish traditions, or even from the book of Genesis itself. Like the one of the most striking things that I've ever heard in terms of philosophy is hearing that Thales thought that the world was originally made of water and then formed out of that water. Like that's not irrelevant if we consider philosophy as something that came from the Israel through Egypt to Greece.
Mhm. So, in conclusion, um, the Greek philosophers read Moses.
Yes.
Okay, next slide. Last slide. We just want to tie this all together by talking about how, I mean, this shouldn't come as a surprise that there are these parallels, historical parallels, and how the three patriarchs who prefigured the Mosaic covenant, how they parallel the three philosophers who prefigured and paved the way for Christian theology for the new covenant. I mean, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, they all had a profound impact on Christian theology. There just wouldn't be Christian theology as we know it without without these three figures. And in a way, like before Socrates, before Plato, like the general consensus in Greece was that it was just a Greek pantheon of gods. It was these three philosophers who um, who came up with the theological arguments or philosophical arguments proving the one God. And these arguments were used by the church fathers in the East and West. I mean, St. John of Damascus, Maximus the Confessor, all of the, and Thomas Aquinas in the West. These people were influenced profoundly by these three philosophers and just Greek philosophy as a whole. Do you have anything to say to that?
nothing other than just briefly mentioning a point that, again, I've learned from Seraphim Hamilton in his videos on Greek philosophy. But the Greeks have played a very important and very interesting role in the development of Christian doctrine, Christian theology, that is not unexpected or surprising at all when you understand the Old Testament context of the world in which Christianity was spreading. I mean, we go back to Genesis 9 and we hear about Shem and Japheth. Shem, whose tent shall be enlarged, or Japheth, who shall be enlarged and shall dwell in the tent of Shem. And then we go to the New Testament and we hear about Paul, who we're told in Acts was a tent maker. And what was Paul's mission? His mission was building the tents of Shem in order that the Japhethites, the Greeks, may be brought in. And it's not irrelevant that in the book to the Romans, Paul explicitly calls out the Greeks, to the Jews first and then the Greeks. He doesn't just always say to the Jews and then more broadly to the Gentiles, but he specifically calls out the Greeks because the Greeks had a specific calling, just as every other group of people, every other culture, every other nation also has a specific calling in paving the way, and not just paving the way for Christ, but also developing the church and moving towards the eschatological unification of heaven and earth in the church.
Brilliant. And now, just to conclude this podcast with a quote by Saint Justin Martyr, who says, "Christ is the Logos of whom the whole race of men partake. Those who lived according to the Logos are Christians, even if they were considered atheists, such as among the Greeks, Socrates and Heraclitus." So, with that, I would like to thank everyone for listening. This was a bit of an unusual podcast, but I hope it was edifying, and we talked about some stuff that you found interesting. And
yeah,
I
and
think
leave comments if there's anything that you
yes,
would like to point out in this context, because this is something that we would both love to learn more about as well.
absolutely. Okay. Well, thank you, Nate, and thanks to everyone listening.
Yeah, thank you all.